This is a reading of Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, read by Momas Najmi. Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 1. After these things, perhaps it comes next to go over what has to do with pleasure, for this seems to be something especially indwelling in our kind, which is why people educate the young by steering them by means of pleasure and pain. And it seems that what is more conducive to virtue of character is to enjoy what one ought and hate what one ought. For these feelings extend through the whole of life, having in them a weight and a power that tend toward virtue and toward a happy life. Since people choose things that are pleasant and avoid things that are painful, and it would seem that one ought least of all to bypass such things, both for other reasons and because they involve a great dispute. For some people say that pleasure is a good, while others at the opposite extreme say it is completely base, some of them perhaps being convinced that it is that way, but others believing that it is better for our life to make pleasure appear to be something base, even if it is not, on the grounds that most people are heavily inclined toward it and are enslaved to their pleasures, on account of which they need to be led to the opposite side, since in that way they would come to the mean. But it may well be that this is not a good thing to say, for words that concern things in the realm of feelings and actions are less believable than deeds are, and when they are discordant with what is perceived, those who say them are despised and discredit the truth along with themselves. For if someone who condemns pleasure is seen sometimes going after it, he seems to incline toward it because all of it is good, since making distinctions is not something most people do. So true statements seem to be the most useful ones, not only for knowing but also for life. For since they are in tune with one's deeds, they are believed, and they encourage those who understand them to live by them. Enough then of such things. Let us go on to the things that have been said about pleasure. Chapter 2. Now Eudoxus believed that pleasure is the good, because one sees that all beings, both rational and irrational, aim at it, while in all things what is choice-worthy is good, and what is most choice-worthy is best. So the fact that all things are carried to the same goal reveals that this is the best thing for them all, for each thing discovers what is good for itself, just as it discovers its food. And what is good for all things, and at which all things aim, is the good. His arguments were convincing on account of the virtue of his character, more than on their own account, since he seemed to be an exceptionally temperate person, so that he seemed to be saying these things not as a lover of pleasure, but because that is the way things are in truth. And he believed that the same thing is no less evident from the opposite side, since pain is in itself something avoided by all things. So likewise its opposite is something choice-worthy. But what is most choice-worthy is that we choose neither on account of anything else, nor for the sake of anything else, and as such, by general agreement, is pleasure. Since no one asks for what purpose one feels pleasure, because pleasure is chosen for itself, and when pleasure is added to any good thing whatever, such as to acting justly or being temperate, it makes it more choice-worthy, but it is by itself that the good is augmented. But surely the latter argument, at any rate, seems to show that pleasure is among the things that are good, but no more so than any other, since every one of them is more choice-worthy with another good thing than when it is alone. Indeed, Plato argues in rebuttal by that sort of argument that pleasure is not the good, since a pleasant life is more choice-worthy, along with intelligence, than apart from it. But if the mixture is better, then pleasure is not the good, for the good does not become any more choice-worthy when something is added to it. And it is clear that nothing else that becomes more choice-worthy along with any of the things that are good in themselves would be the good either. But what is of that sort that we have any share in? For that is the sort of thing being sought. On the other hand, those who argue in opposition that what all things aim at is not good are not saying anything. For those things that seem so to all people, we declare to be so. And someone who destroys that trust will not very likely say anything that is more to be trusted. For if it were only things without intelligence that desire pleasant things, there would be something in what they say. But if beings with judgment desire them as well, how could they be saying anything? And perhaps even in the lower animals, there is something naturally good that is stronger than themselves are, that aims at their proper good. And what has to do with the contrary of pleasure does not seem to be well reasoned either, for they claim that it does not follow, if pain is something bad, that pleasure is something good, since a bad thing can also be the opposite of a bad thing, and both of them can be opposed to something neutral. The reason they give is not wrong, but it is surely not true in the case of things they are speaking of. For if both pleasure and pain were something bad things, both of them ought to be avoided, while if they were among neutral things, neither of them ought to be avoided, or both of them in a similar way. But as things are, it is obvious that people avoid one of them as bad and choose the other as good. Hence it is in that way that they are opposed. Chapter 3. Nor is it the case that if pleasure is not classed among qualities, it is for that reason not among good things either. For the ways of being at work that belong to virtue are not qualities, and neither is happiness. And they say that the good is definite, while pleasure is indefinite, because it admits of being more and less. Now if they judge this from the experience of being pleased, then the same conclusion would also have to apply to justice and the other virtues, in relation to which people plainly speak of those who are of that sort, and who act in accord with the virtues, more and less. For people are more just or more courageous, and it is possible to act justly or be temperate more or less. If, however, they judge by the pleasures, then it may be that they do not state the reason, if they are unmixed as well as mixed pleasures. And what prevents pleasure from being the same way health is, which, though it is definite, admits of being more and less? For the same proportion of things is not present in everyone, nor is a certain one always present in the same person. But while it slackens, it stays present up to a certain point, and differs as more and less. So what has to do with pleasure also admits of being of that sort. And having set it down, that the good is complete, while motions and processes of coming into being are incomplete, they are to show that pleasure is a motion and a process of coming into being, but they do not seem to be right in arguing even that it is a motion. For swiftness and slowness seem to be properties of every motion, if not in themselves, as with the motion of the cosmos then in relation to another motion, but these do not belong to pleasure in either way, for it is possible to become pleased quickly, just as it is possible to get angry quickly, but it is not possible to be pleased quickly, even in relation to someone else, as it is possible to walk and to grow and all such things. So it is possible to change into pleasure quickly or slowly, but it is not possible to be at work in accord with it. I mean to be pleased quickly. And how could it be a process of coming into being? For it does not seem that a thing happens to come into being out of any chance thing, but that it comes into being out of that into which it is dissolved. And pain would be the destruction of that of which pleasure is the coming into being. They say that pain is a deficiency of what is natural, and pleasure a restoration of it. But these are things that happen to the body, so a pleasure is a restoration of what is natural, and that in which the restoration takes place would also feel the pleasure, therefore this would be the body. But that does not seem to be the case. Therefore the restoration is not the pleasure. But when a restoration comes about, one would feel pleasure, as one would feel pain when being wounded. Their opinions seem to have come from the pains and pleasures involved with food. For when people have come to be in need of it and have first felt pain, they feel pleasure at being filled up again. But this does not happen with all pleasures, since the pleasures of mathematics are free of pain. And among the pleasures that come from the senses, so are those that come by smell, and also many things that are heard and seen, as well as memories and hopes. So what will these be the processes of coming into being? For no lack of anything has come about of which there could be a restoration. To those who bring up the pleasures that are matters of reproach, one might say that these are not pleasant. For just because they are pleasant to people who are in a bad condition, one ought not to suppose that they would also be pleasant to anyone except these, just as in the case of things that are healthy, or sweet, or bitter, to people who are sick, or things that appear white to people who have a disease of the eyes. Or one might say something along the lines that the pleasures are choice-worthy, but not when they come from those things, just as it is choice-worthy to get rich, but not by betraying someone, or to be healthy but not by eating just anything, or else pleasures differ in kind, for the ones that come from beautiful things are different from the ones that come from shameful things, for it is not possible to feel the pleasure that comes from something just without being a just person, or the pleasure that comes from something musical without being a musical person, and similarly in the other cases. And the fact that a friend is different from a flatterer seems to make it clear that pleasure is either not good or varies in kind, since the former seems to associate with others with a view to the good, and the latter with a view to pleasure, and people reproach the latter and praise the former as associating with a view to different things. Also, no one would choose to live throughout life having the thinking of a child, even when having as much as possible the pleasures by which children are pleased, nor to enjoy something of the most shameful kind, even if one is never going to feel any pain from it. And we would eagerly exert ourselves for many things even if they were to bring no pleasure, such as seeing, remembering, knowing, and having the virtues, and if pleasures necessarily follow along with these things, that makes no difference, since we would choose them even if no pleasure were to come from them. It seems to be clear then that pleasure is not the good, and that not every pleasure is choice-worthy, and that there are some pleasures that are choice-worthy in themselves, differing in kind, or in the things they come from. So let this be a sufficient discussion of the things that are said about pleasure and pain. Chapter 4. For what pleasure is, or what sort of thing it is, would become more evident to those who take it up again from its source. Now the activity of seeing seems to be complete over any time whatever, for there is nothing it lacks which would complete its form by coming about at a later time. Pleasure too is like something of the sort, for it is something whole, and there is no time at which one could take a pleasure, the form of which would become complete after it went on for a longer time. Hence pleasure is not a motion, since every motion is in time and directed at some end, as house building is, and is complete when it brings about that at which it aims, that is, in the whole of the time, or at that time. But all the motions that are in parts of the time are incomplete, and are different in form from the whole and from one another. For setting stones together is different from making grooves in a column, and these motions differ from the making of the temple. The making of the temple is something complete, for it is lacking nothing in relation to what was intended. But the making of the foundation or of a decorative tablet is incomplete, since each of these is the making of a part. They are different in form then, and it is not possible to find a motion complete in its form in any time whatever except in the whole. And it is similar in the case of walking and the rest of the motions. For if change of place is a motion from somewhere to somewhere, there are also differences of form within this, flying, walking, jumping, and such. But not only are there differences in that way, but also within walking itself, since the from which to which is not the same in a racetrack as in a part of it, or in one part as in another, nor is traversing this line here the same as traversing that one over there. For not only does one pass through a line, but a line that is in a place, and this one is in a different place from that one. What has to do with motion has been discussed with precision in other writings, but it seems that it is not complete in every stretch of time, but the many motions within it are incomplete and differ in form, if the from where to where defines the form. But the form of a pleasure is complete in any time whatever. It is clear then that they must be different from one another, and that pleasure is one of the things that are whole and complete. This would be apparent also from the fact that it is not possible to be in motion except in a stretch of time, but it is possible to feel pleasure, for what it is in the now is something whole, and it is clear from these things that they are not right even in saying that there is a motion of coming into being with respect to pleasure. For these are spoken of as belonging not to all things, but only to those that have parts and are not wholes, since there is no coming into being of seeing, or of a point, or of a numerical unit, nor does any kind of motion or becoming belong to these, neither then do they belong to pleasure, for it is something whole. Now since every one of the senses is at work in relation to something perceptible, and is completely at work when it is in its best condition, and directed towards the most beautiful of the things perceptible by that sense, for it seems that its complete being at work is of this sort most of all, and let it make no difference to speak of the sense itself, or of the organ in which it is present as being at work. For each sense, that way of being at work is best that belongs to what is in its best condition, directed toward the best of what is perceptible by it. This would be most complete and most pleasant, for there is a pleasure that goes with each of these senses, and similarly with thinking and contemplation, and its most complete activity is most pleasant, and it is most complete when it belongs to a power that is in good condition directed toward that which is of most serious worth among the things apprehended by it, and the pleasure brings the activity to completion. But the pleasure does not complete it in the same manner that the perceptible thing and the power of perceiving do when they are of serious worth, just as health and a doctor are not responsible in similar ways for one's being healthy. And it is clear that pleasure comes with each of the senses, since we speak even of things seen and heard as being pleasant. And it is clear too that this is greatest whenever the sense is at its best and is at work upon something of the same sort. When the thing perceiving and the thing perceived are at their best, there will always be pleasure when what acts and what is acted upon are present to one another. But the pleasure brings the activity to completion, not as an active condition present within it all along, but as something that comes over it, like the bloom of well-being in people who are at the peak of their powers. So as long as the intelligible or perceptible thing and the power that discerns or contemplates it are such as they ought to be, there will be pleasure in their being at work. For while the thing acted upon and the thing acting remain as they are and have the same relation to one another, the same thing naturally comes about. How is it then that no one feels pleasure continuously? Does one get tired? For it is impossible for anything belonging to a human being to be at work continuously, so that pleasure does not come to be continuous either, since it follows the activity. Some things give delight when they are new, but not to a similar extent later. For this same reason, first one's thinking is excited and is at work upon them with full concentration, as in the case of sight, when people look intently at something, but afterwards the activity is not that way but is negligent, and hence the pleasure grows dim. But one might assume that all beings reach out for pleasure because they all desire to live. Life is a certain kind of being at work, and each person is at work in connection with those things and by means of those capacities that satisfy him most. A musical person by hearing and with melodies, a lover of learning by thinking and with topics of contemplation, and so too with each of the rest. The pleasure brings the activities to completion, and hence brings living to completion, which is what they all strive for. It is reasonable then that they also aim at pleasure, since it brings living to fulfillment for each of them, which is worthy of choice. For the present, let the question be dismissed whether we choose to live for the sake of pleasure or choose pleasure for the sake of living, for these appear to be joined together and incapable of separation. For without being at work, no pleasure comes about, and pleasure brings every way of being at work to completion. Chapter 5. This is also why pleasures seem to differ in kind, since we believe that things that are different in kind are brought to completion by different means. For this is obviously so with natural things and those made by art, such as animals, trees, a picture, a statue, a house, and a utensil. Similarly, ways of being at work that are different in kind are brought to completion by means that differ in kind. But the activities of thinking differ in kind from those of perceiving, and these differ in kind from one another, and so too with the pleasures that complete them. This would be apparent also from the way in which each of the pleasures is bound up with the activity it completes, since the appropriate pleasure contributes to the growth of the activity. For those who are at work with pleasure discern each sort of thing better and are more precise about it. For example, people who enjoy doing geometry become skilled at geometry and understand each part of it more. And likewise, those who love music or architecture or each of the other pursuits become better at their particular work because they enjoy it. The pleasures make the activities grow, and what makes something grow is of its own kind. But things that are alike in kind with activities different in kind are themselves different in kind. And this might be still more clear from the fact that pleasures from different sources are impediments to activities. For people who are passionately devoted to the flute are unable to pay attention to arguments if they hear someone playing a flute, since they enjoy the flute playing more than the activity that presently occupies them. So the pleasure derived from the flute playing ruins the activity that involves argument. And this happens in a similar way in other cases as well, whenever one is at work at two things at the same time, since the one that is more pleasant knocks the other aside, and more so whenever it greatly surpasses it in pleasure, with the result that one stops being at work at the other. For this reason, when we are enjoying anything at all intensely, we hardly do anything else at all. But when we are mildly pleased with things of one sort, we do things of other sorts. For instance, people who eat snacks in theaters do this most when the actors are bad. And since their own particular pleasure add precision to ways of being at work and make them longer lasting and better, while pleasures of different kinds wreck them, it is clear that there is great difference among them. For the pleasures that differ from those of the activities do just about the same thing as their own particular pains. For their own pains ruin activities, as in a case when writing or calculating is unpleasant or painful to someone, since the one does not write and the other does not calculate when the activity is painful. So opposite things happen to activities as a result of their own pleasures and pains, and those that are their own are the ones that come about in the course of the activity itself. And it was said that the pleasures that differ from those of the activities do something very much like the pain, since they ruin the activities, though not in the same manner. Now, since ways of being at work differ in decency and baseness, and since some are to be chosen, others are to be avoided, and still others are neutral, their pleasures also differ similarly, since a special pleasure goes with each activity. The special pleasure in an activity of serious worth is decent, and the special pleasure in a base activity is corrupt, since even the desires for beautiful things are praised, while those for shameful things are blamed. But the pleasures that are in them are more closely akin to activities that are the appetites for them, since the appetites are distinct from them in both time and nature, while the pleasures are close together with the activities, and so inseparable that there is dispute whether the being at work is the same thing as a pleasure. However, it does not seem likely that the pleasure is the thinking or the perceiving, since that would be absurd, but because they are not separated, they appear the same to some people. Just as the ways of being at work are different, then, so too are the pleasures. Since sight surpasses touch in purity, and hearing and smell surpass taste, and their pleasure differ in a similar way, and the pleasures that have to do with thinking surpass these, and those of each sort have differences one from another. And there seems to be a particular pleasure for each sort of animal, just as there is also a particular kind of work, since the pleasure is in accord with the way of being at work. And this will be apparent to one who considers each kind, since different sorts of pleasure belong to a horse, a dog, and a human being. As Heraclitus says, donkeys would rather have garbage than gold, since food is more pleasant than gold to donkeys. So the pleasures of different species of animals are themselves different in species, and it would be reasonable for those belonging to the same species to be undifferentiated. But in the case of human beings at least, they differ by no small amount. For the same things delight some and give pain to others, and things that are painful and hateful for some are pleasant and lovable to others. This also applies to things that are sweet, since the same things do not seem sweet to someone with a fever and to someone healthy, nor does the same thing seem hot to a sickly person and to someone in good shape, and this happens similarly in other cases. But in all such matters it seems that a thing is what it shows itself to be to a person of serious moral stature. And if this is beautifully said, as it seems to be, then the measure of each thing is virtue, or a good person, insofar as he is good, and what appear to be pleasures to this person would be pleasures, and the things he enjoys would be pleasant. And if some things that are hard for this person to endure appear pleasant to someone, that is nothing to be wondered at, since many kinds of corruption and damage happen to human beings. And these things are not pleasant except to those people and others with that disposition. So it is clear that one ought not say that things that are agreed to be shameful are pleasures, except for those who are corrupt. But among the pleasures that seem to be decent, which sort or which one ought to one say is that of a human being? Or is this clear from the ways of being at work, since the pleasures follow upon these? So if there is one or more than one activity belonging to the man who is fulfilled and blessed, the pleasures that bring them to completion should be spoken of in the governing sense as the pleasures of a human being, while the rest are pleasures in a secondary and greatly diminished sense, corresponding to their activities. Chapter 6. Now that the things having to do with the virtues, with friendships and with pleasures have been discussed, What remains is to go through in outline what has to do with happiness, since we set this down as the end at which human things aim. And the account of it would be shorter for those who take up again what has been said before. Now we said that happiness is not an active condition, since it could then be present in someone who was asleep throughout life, living the life of a vegetable, or in someone suffering the greatest misfortunes. So if these consequences are not satisfactory, but one ought instead to place happiness in some form of being at work, as in what was said before, and among ways of being at work, some are necessary and are chosen for the sake of something else, while others are for their own sake. It is clear that one ought to place happiness as one of those that are chosen for their own sake, and not among those that are for the sake of something else, since happiness stands in need of nothing but is self-sufficient, and those activities are chosen for their own sake from which nothing is sought beyond the being at work, and actions in accord with virtue seem to be of this sort, since performing actions that are beautiful and serious is something chosen for its own sake. But so are the pleasures that come from playing, since they are not chosen for the sake of any other things. People are harmed by them more than they are benefited, since they neglect their bodies and their property. But many of those who are considered happy escape into pastimes of this sort, and for this reason people who are charming in such ways of passing the time are highly regarded around tyrants, for they display themselves to the latter as pleasing in those things which they aim at, and the people tyrants need are of that sort. It seems then that these pastimes are conducive to happiness because those who are in power spend their leisure in them. But perhaps such people are no indication, since virtue does not consist in having power, nor does intelligence, and the activities that are of serious worth come from these. And if those people run off to bodily pleasures because they have no taste for pleasure that is pure and suited to people who are free, one ought not to believe on that account that those pleasures are more worthy of choice. Even children believe that the things valued by themselves are the best things. So it is reasonable that, just as different things appear worthwhile to children and to men, so too do different things appear worthwhile to people of a low sort and to decent people. As has been said repeatedly, the things that are worthwhile and pleasant to a person of a serious moral stature are the ones that are so to each person. The way of being at work that results from his own active condition is the most choice-worthy, and to a person of serious worth that is the activity that results from virtue. Therefore, happiness does not consist in play, for it would even be absurd for our end to be play, and to work hard and undergo troubles all through one's life for the sake of playing. For we choose everything, so to speak, for the sake of something else, except happiness, since this is the end. But to the earnest and to labor for the sake of play seems foolish and too childish. But to play in order that one might be serious, as Anarchist says, seems to be right, since play seems like relaxation, and since people are incapable of laboring continuously, they need relaxation. So relaxation is not the end, since it seems about for the sake of being at work, and the happy life seems to be in accord with virtue, and this involves seriousness, and does not consist in play. And we speak of serious things as better than those that bring laughter and involve play, and say that the activity of the better part or of the better person is always the more serious, and the activity of what is better is more powerful and more conducive to happiness from the start. And any random person or a slave might enjoy bodily pleasures no less than the best person, but no one would grant a share of happiness to a slave if he does not even have a share in his life. For happiness does not consist in such pastimes, but in activities in accord with virtue, as was said before. Chapter 7. But if happiness is being at work in accord with virtue, it is reasonable that it would be in accord with the most powerful virtue, and this would belong to the best part. Now whether this is intellect or some other part that seems by nature to rule and lead and have a conception about things that are beautiful and divine, and to be either divine itself or the most divine of the things in us. The being at work of this part in accord with its own proper virtue would be complete happiness. That this way of being at work is contemplative has been said, and this would seem to be in agreement with the things said before and with the truth. For this way of being at work is the most powerful, since the intellect is the most powerful of the things in us, and the things with which the intellect is concerned are the most powerful of the things that can be known. It is also the most continuous, for we are more able to contemplate continuously than to act in any way whatever. And we believe that pleasure must be mixed in with happiness, and by general agreement the most pleasant of the ways of being at work in accord with virtue is that which goes along with wisdom. At any rate, philosophy seems to have pleasures that are wonderful in their purity and stability, and it is reasonable that the way of life of those who have knowledge is more pleasant than that of those who are seeking it. And what is referred to as self-sufficiency would be present most of all in the contemplative life. For while the wise and the just person and the rest are in need of the things that are necessary for living, when they are sufficiently equipped with such things, a just person still needs people toward whom and with whom he will act justly. And similarly with the temperate and the courageous person and each of the others. But the wise person is able to contemplate even when he is by himself, and more so to the extent that he is the more wise. He will contemplate better, no doubt, when he has people to work with, but he is still the most sufficient person, and contemplation seems to be the only activity loved for its own sake, for nothing comes from it beyond the contemplating, while from things involving action we gain something for ourselves, to a greater or lesser extent, beyond the action, and happiness seems to be present in leisure, for we engage in unleisured pursuits in order that we may be at leisure, and we make war in order that we may stay at peace. Now the activity of the virtues that involve action is present in political pursuits, and in things that pertain to war, and the actions that have to do with these things seem to be unleisured. Completely so with the actions involved in war, for no one chooses to make war for the sake of making war, or even prepares for war in that way, since anyone would seem to be completely bloodthirsty if he were to make friends into enemies so that battles and killings might come about. But the activity of the person engaged in politics is also unleisured, and political activity achieves beyond itself positions of power and honors and happiness for oneself and one's fellow citizens that is different from their political life, and which it is clear that we seek as something different from it. So if, among actions in accord with the virtues, those that pertain to politics and war are preeminent in beauty and magnitude, but they are unleisured and aim at some end and are not chosen for their own sake, while the being at work of the intellect seems to excel in seriousness, and to be contemplative and aim at no end beyond itself, and to have its own pleasure, which increases its activity, so that what it is as self-sufficient, leisured, and unvaried as possible for a human being, and all the other things that are attributed to a blessed person show themselves as the things that resulted from this way of being at work. Then this would be the complete happiness of a human being, if it takes in a complete span of life. For none of the things that belong to happiness is incomplete, but such a life would be greater than what accords with the human being, for it is not insofar as one is a human being that he will live in this way, but insofar as something divine is present in him, and to the extent that this surpasses the compound being, to that extent also the being at work of it surpasses that which results from the rest of virtue. So if the intellect is something divine as compared with the human being, the life that is in accord with the intellect is divine as compared with a human being. But one should not follow those who advise us to think human thoughts, since we are human, and mortal thoughts, since we are mortal, but as far as possible one ought to be immortal, and to do all things with a view toward living in accord with the most powerful thing in oneself. For even if it is small in bulk, it rises much more above everything else in power and worth, and each person would even seem to be this part, if it is the governing and better part. It would be strange then if anyone were to choose not his own life but that of something else. What was said before will be fitting now too. What is appropriate by nature to each being is best and most pleasant for each. And so for a human being, this is the life in accord with the intellect, if that most of all is a human being. Therefore this life is also the happiest. Chapter 8. The life in accord with the rest of virtue is happy in a secondary way, since the activities that result from it are human ones. For we act toward one another in ways that are just and courageous, and in accord with the virtues in other respects in our dealings and necessary services and actions of all sorts, as well as in our feelings, by observing what is suitable to each, and all these appear to be human concerns. Some of them even seem to derive from the body, and in many respects virtue of character is bound up together with our feelings, and practical judgment is linked together with virtue of character, and it with practical judgment. If the sources of practical judgment are dependent upon virtues of character, while the right thing belonging to virtues of character is dependent upon practical judgment, these may also be entangled with the passions that have to do with the compound being. But the virtues of the compound are of a human sort, so that the life and the happiness that are in accord with these are human as well. But the happiness that belongs to the intellect is separate. Let this much be said about it, for to be precise about it is something greater than the topic at hand, and it would seem to have little need of external props, or less than virtue of character has. For both there is a need for necessary things, and let it be equal, even if someone involved in politics goes to more trouble about his body and things of that sort, since it would differ to some small extent, but for the activities there will be a greater difference. For the generous person will need money for performing generous acts, and so will a just person, for paying back what is due, since wishes are unseen, and even people who are not just pretend to wish to act justly. And a courageous person will need strength if he has to accomplish any of the things that go with his virtue, and a temperate person will need opportunity, for how else will he or any of the others be manifest? It is also a matter of dispute whether the choice or the actions are more determining of virtue, since it is present in both. It is clear that the completeness of it would consist in both together. But for the actions many things are needed, and more of them to the extent that the actions are of greater magnitude and more beautiful. But for someone who contemplates there is no need of such things, for his being at work, rather one might say they get in the way of his contemplating. But insofar as he is a human being and lives in company with a number of people, he chooses to do the things that have to do with virtue, and thus will have need of such things in order to live a human life. That complete happiness is a contemplative activity would also be made clear by the following consideration. We assume that the gods, most of all, are blessed and happy. But what sort of actions will it be right to attribute to them? Acts of justice? Or will it appear ridiculous if they make contracts and return items held in trust and all that sort of thing? How about courageous acts, enduring frightening things and taking risks because that is a beautiful thing? Or generous acts, to whom will they give? And it will be absurd if they were to have a currency or any such thing. And what would their temperate acts be? Or will praising them for not having base desires be impertinent? And for someone who goes through them all, it would be obvious that the things involved in actions are small and unworthy of the gods. But surely everyone supposes that they are alive at any rate, and are therefore at work, for they are surely not asleep and demion. But when someone who is living is deprived of acting, and still more of making anything, what remains except contemplation? So the being at work of a god, surpassing in blessedness, would be contemplative, And so among human activities, the one most akin to this would be the most happy. A sign of this as well is that the rest of the animals do not participate in happiness, since they are completely derived of such an activity. For the gods, the whole of life is blessed, and for human beings it is so to the extent that there is in it some likeness to such a way of being at work. But none of the other animals is happy, since they do not share in contemplation at all. So happiness extends as far as contemplation does, and the more it belongs to any beings to contemplate, the more it belongs to them to be happy, not incidentally but as a result of contemplating, since this is worthwhile in itself. And so happiness would be some sort of contemplation. But there will also be a need of external prosperity for one who is a human being, since nature is not self-sufficient for contemplating. But there is also a need for the body to be healthy and for food and other attentions to be present. But one certainly ought not to suppose that someone who is going to be happy will need many things or grand ones. If it is not possible to be blessed without external goods, for self-sufficiency does not consist in excess any more than action does, and it is possible for one who is not a ruler of land and sea to perform beautiful actions. For one would be capable of acting in accord with virtue from moderate means, and it is possible to see this plainly, since private people seem to perform decent actions not less than powerful people but even more. And it is sufficient if that much is present, since the life of someone who is at work in accord with virtue will be happy. And Solon perhaps beautifully revealed those who are happy, saying they are those who have been supplied with external things in measure, who have performed the most beautiful deeds, as he supposed them, and who have lived temperately, for someone with moderate possessions is capable of acting as one ought. And Anaxagoras, too, seems to have believed that the happy person is neither rich nor powerful, when he said that it would be nothing to wonder at if such a person would appear strange to most people, since they judge by externals, perceiving these alone. So the opinions of the wise seem to be in harmony with our arguments. Now such things have some trustworthiness, but the truth in matters of actions is discerned from deeds and from life, since they are the determining thing in these matters. So we ought to examine the things that have been said by applying them to deeds and to life. And if they are in harmony with the deeds, one ought to accept them, while if they are out of tune, one ought to consider them just words. But the person who is at work with the intellect and takes care of this and is disposed in the best way toward it seems also to be the most dear to the gods. For if some care for human beings comes from the gods, as is believed, then it would also be reasonable for them to delight in what is best and most akin to them, and this would be the intellect, and to do good in return to those who love and honor this most, since such people care for the things that are dear to them, and also act rightly and beautifully. And it is not unclear that all these things belong most of all to one who is wise. Therefore he is most dear to the gods, and it is likely that the same person is the happiest. So in this way too, a wise person would be the most happy. Chapter 9. Now if what has to do with happiness, as well as with the virtues, and also with friendship and pleasure, has been sufficiently discussed in outline, ought one to assume that our chosen task has its end, or, as has been said, is the end in matters of action, not contemplating and knowing each of them, but rather doing them. Then it is not sufficient to know about virtue, but one must try to have it and use it, unless there is some other way that we become good. Now if discourses by themselves were sufficient for making people decent, then justly they would take many large fees, as Theognis says, and one would need to provide them. But as things are, discourses appear to have the power to encourage and stimulate open-natured young people, and would make a well-born character that loves what is truly beautiful be inspired with virtue. but they are unable to encourage most people toward what is beautiful and good, for they are naturally obedient, not to respect, but to fear, and refrain from base actions, not on account of shame, but on account of penalties. For since they live by feelings, they pursue the pleasures that they are comfortable with, and the things by means of which these will come about, and avoid the pains opposed to these pleasures, while they have no notion of what is beautiful and truly pleasant, having had no taste of it. What sort of discourse, then, could reform such people? For it is not possible or not easy to change by words things that have been bound up in people's characters since long ago. Perhaps one should be content if, when everything is present by which we seem to become decent, we might gain a share of virtue. Now, some people think one becomes good by nature, others think it is by habit, and still others think it is by teaching. As for what comes from nature, it is clear that it is not up to us that it is present, but by some divine cause it belongs to those who are fortunate in the true sense. And argument and teaching are perhaps not powerful in all people, but it is necessary for the soul of the listener to have been worked on beforehand by means of habits, with a view to enjoying and hating in a beautiful way, like ground that is going to nourish the seed. For someone who lives by feelings could not hear words that would turn him away, nor could he even understand them. When someone is in that condition, how is it possible to change his mind? And in general, feelings seems to yield not to reasoned speech, but to force. So it is necessary for a character to be present in advance that it is in some way appropriate for virtue, loving what is beautiful and scorning what is shameful. But it is difficult to hit upon a right training towards virtue from youth, when one has not been brought up under laws of that sort. For living temperately and with endurance is not pleasant to most people, and especially not to the young. Hence it is necessary to arrange for rearing and exercises by laws, since they will not be painful when they have become habitual. And no doubt it is not enough for people to hit upon the right rearing and discipline when they are young, but also afterward, when they have reached adulthood. They must practice these things and habituate themselves, and we would need laws about these things as well, and so generally about the whole of life, for most people are more obedient to compulsion than to argument, and are persuaded more by penalties than by what is beautiful. This is why some people think the lawmakers ought to exhort people to virtue and encourage them to act for the sake of what is beautiful, since those who have been guided decently in penalties on those who are disobedient or lacking in natural capacity, and banish altogether from among them those who are incurable. For a decent person who lives with a view to what is beautiful is obedient to argument, but a corrupt person who strives for pleasure is disciplined by pain like a beast of burden. Hence these thinkers also say that the pains inflicted ought to be of the sort that are most opposed to the pleasures people like. So if, as was said, someone who is going to be good needs to have been raised and habituated in a beautiful way, and if he needs to live in that way amid decent practices and not do things that are base either unwillingly or willingly, these things would happen to people whose lives are conducted with some intelligence and right ordering, so long as it has strength. So while a father's orders do not have strength or compulsion, nor in general do those of any man who is not a king or something of that sort, the law has a compulsory power, while being speech that comes from a certain thoughtfulness and intelligence. Now among human beings, those who oppose people's impulses are hated even when they do so rightly, but the law is not hated when it orders what is decent. But in the city of the Spartans alone, or among few others, does the lawgiver seem to have taken care for upbringing and exercises, while in most cities they have been utterly careless about such things, and each person lives the way he wants, laying down the law for his children and wife in the manner of a cyclops. The best thing then is for there to be a public concern that is right and has the power to do this. But when there is a lack of concern in public, it would seem appropriate for each person to make some contribution to the virtue of his own children and friends, or at least to choose to do so. And it would seem from what has been said that he would be more capable of doing this if he became knowledgeable about lawmaking. For it is clear that public concerns are brought about by means of laws, and that the decent ones are brought about by laws of serious merit. And it would seem to make no difference whether they are written or unwritten, or whether one or many people will be educated by means of them, any more than in the case of music or gymnastics or other exercises. For just as legal regulations and national characters have strength in cities, so too in households. The father's words and habits have strength, and still more so on account of kingship and the good that is done, since his family members are already loving and obedient to him by nature. And further, educations tailored to each person are better than those that are given in common, just as in the case of medical treatment, for in general, rest and fasting are beneficial for someone with a fever, but perhaps not for some particular person, and a boxing instructor probably does not impose the same way of fighting on all people. So it would seem that what is applied to each is more precise when private care is given, since each person gets more of what is suited to him. But a doctor, a gymnastic trainer, or anyone else in general would give the best care in one case by knowing what applies to everyone, or to people of a certain sort, for the kinds of knowledge are spoken of us and are about what is common. However, no doubt nothing prevents even someone who is without knowledge from giving care beautifully to some one person, if he has by experience observed with precision what happens in each instance, just as some people also seem to be their own best doctors, but would be incapable of giving any help to anyone else. Nonetheless, no doubt, for someone who wants to become skilled and able to contemplate, it would seem to be the case that he must go on to what is universal, and be as well acquainted as possible with that too. For it was said that the kinds of knowledge are concerned with that. Presumably then also, for someone who wants to make people better by giving care, whether to many people or to few, what one ought to do is try to become knowledgeable about lawmaking, if he might become good by means of laws. For it is surely not in the power of just anyone to get whoever is put in front of him into a beautiful condition. But if it is in anyone's power, it is in that of the one who knows, just as in the case of medical skill, or of the other areas about which there is some caregiving and practical judgment. After this, then, ought one not to consider from what source and in what manner one might become knowledgeable about lawmaking? Is it not, as in other cases, from the politicians? For this did seem to be a part of politics. Or does it seem to be dissimilar in the case of politics, and in those of the other capacities and kinds of knowledge? For in the other cases, as with doctors and painters, it is obviously the same people who transmit the capacities and are at work at them. But the sophists profess to teach the things that have to do with politics, while none of them practices them, but instead those who engage in politics do, who would appear to do so by some capacity and experience, rather than by thinking things through. For they obviously neither write nor speak about such things, even though that would perhaps be a more beautiful thing than writing speeches for law courts and popular assemblies. Nor in turn have they made their sons or any of their other friends politicians. But that would have been reasonable if they were capable of it. For they could not have left anything better to their cities, nor would they have chosen for anything greater to belong to themselves, or to those dearest to them, than such a capacity. Experience seems to contribute no small amount to it though, for otherwise people would not have become politicians by means of political dealings with one another. Hence, for those who aim at knowing about politics, it would seem that there is an additional need for experience, and those of the sophists who profess that art seem to be very far from teaching it. For they do not even know at all what sort of thing or what sorts of things it is concerned with, otherwise they would not class it as the same as, or even inferior to, rhetoric, nor would they think it is an easy thing for someone to make laws by collecting the laws that are well thought of, since he would be able to pick out the best ones, as if picking them out did not require understanding, and judging them rightly were not a very great task, as it would be in matters pertaining to music. For it is those who have experience with each sort of thing who judge its works rightly, and understand by what means and in what manner they are achieved, and what sorts of things harmonize with what others. For those who lack experience, it is good enough if they do not fail to notice whether the work is well or badly made, as in the case of painting. The laws seem to be the works of the political art. How then could anyone become skilled in lawmaking from these, or judge the best ones? For it is manifest that people do not even become medical doctors from textbooks, even though these attempt to state not only the treatments but also the manner in which one might cure people and how one needs to treat each sort, distinguishing them by their conditions. While these writings seem to be of benefit to people with experience, to those who have no knowledge they are useless. So perhaps collections of laws and constitutions would be useful to those who are capable of examining them and judging what is good or the contrary, and what sorts of things harmonize with what. But for those who, lacking that active capacity, go through such things, it would not be possible to judge them well except spontaneously, though perhaps one might become more astute about them. Since then, what has to do with lawmaking has been left undiscovered by those who have gone before. Perhaps it would be better to examine it ourselves instead, and to examine what has to do with the political constitution as a whole, in order that the philosophic inquiry about human things might be brought to completion as far as is in our power. First then, if anything partial has been well said by our predecessors, let us try to go through it, and then on the basis of the collection of constitutions to look at what sorts of things preserve and destroy cities, and what sorts do so for each sort of constitution, and for what reasons some are governed well and others are the reverse. For when these things have been examined, perhaps we might also have more insight into what sort of constitution is best, and how each sort is best arranged, and by using what laws and customs. So having made a beginning, let us discuss it. End of Book 10 and End of Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, read by Mohammed Najmi. Thank you for listening.